So this is a presentation that I gave in Chicago on the 11th of March before the world shut down, and as such it's fairly current. So as I was saying to a few minutes ago, this is really not possible without our clients, and in this case, which is Wickman Enterprises and New Land in Partnership. Our construction team is a joint venture between C.D. Smith and Catalyst Construction. Thornton Tomasetti is our structural engineer, and Swinnerton is our mass timber specialist. They're based out of Portland, Oregon. So the building that we're proposing today or discussing today is called Ascent, and I will just dive right into it and our sort of history with mass timber. So this is a random image that I found on the internet, but this is an architectural record innovation conference. I attended in 2012. This is about a month before Hurricane Sandy smashed into New York. The gentleman at the podium is an architect named Michael Green, who was an early advocate of mass timber. And he was, again, this is 8 years ago now, was, talking about the possibility of 40-story timber buildings, and as a thought exercise, and did a white paper on how it might be possible. So really what happened was, and here I am in the back of the room, talking to a gentleman that I happened to be sitting next to. We were talking about not work, and it turns out that he was a structural engineer. He was from Chicago. He had a child in college at MSOE. And so at the end of Michael Green's talk, I said to this gentleman, is this for real? And he said, it's absolutely for real. And it turns out it's Bill Baker from Skidmore, Owings & Merrill, who is the engineer of the tallest building in the world. So he got up and presented that 2 hours later. So that really got my attention. And we had been sort of following it ever since. So that's sort of how, that was my introduction to mass timber. And we'll go through briefly what's currently allowed in Wisconsin, this is a building we designed for the same group that's on hold pending financing. So in Wisconsin right now, you are allowed as of right to build up to 7 stories in heavy timber with a 1-story concrete podium, which we'll see a little later in the presentation. So this is what's allowed by right. So 85 feet tall, 6 stories of timber over a concrete podium. A couple of examples of mass timber. This is currently the tallest mass timber building in North America. It's 18 stories. It's a dormitory at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver. And it's a great demonstration project. The problem we have with this building is every inch of timber in this building is encapsulated with 3 layers of drywall. You don't actually get to see any timber. So despite its sustainable properties, our sort of collective question was, well, what's the point? But we'll get into that later. So this is the tallest mass timber building that has been permitted in the United States. This is a 12-story high-rise in Portland, Oregon. It's called Framework. So they went through all the testing, which we'll touch on. They got a building permit, and then unfortunately, for financial reasons, the project was canceled. So, but you can see this was the tallest one in the United States, and its timber was exposed. So this project is critical because this represents how we got our path to approval. So because they did it basically through a performance-based testing process, which we'll touch on. This is currently the tallest mass timber building in the United States. It's 8 stories in Portland, Oregon. So again, and we'll touch on this. This building has much of its timber is exposed. This, as of last year, is the tallest mass timber building in the world, and it's a little deceiving because the way that these buildings are classified. This trellis that they added to the top of the building counts towards the building height. It was not the original design. The designers added it later in the game to claim the record, basically, from a building in Austria. This is going back to carbon 12 in Portland, Oregon. So you see, part of the reason our clients are interested in mass timber is it's just the aesthetic is great. It's a biophilic result, which is proven to be good for well-being, and humans just react well to natural materials. And so this is a good precedent for what we're trying to achieve. You will see that in certain areas the timber is concealed. That generally happens where plumbing is coming down from above. But again, you see the aesthetic is just fantastic. There's a bedroom. So jumping to our site, this is on the corner of Van Buren and Kilbourne on the north edge of downtown Milwaukee. You can see a number of residential high-rises in the immediate vicinity, including a 22-story building directly across the street. It was the old Eduardo's Pizza. That building has now been demolished, and the site is being prepared for construction. So our proposal is a hybrid building, and it is 6 stories of post-tension concrete, which is a parking structure, which is sort of the white area you see at the bottom. And it's topped by 19 stories of mass timber. But again, it is a hybrid. The building cores are poured-in-place concrete, and that's partly just due to our discussions with the fire department, and just partly to have consistent shafts for stairs and elevators. It's 260 apartments, over 335 parking spaces, and the 25th floor is all residential amenity space, which we'll dive into a little bit. So aside from the aesthetics, the question becomes, why do this? Because it's actually pretty much the most expensive way you could build a building in this country right now. And our engineers did a study on why, how much, for instance, carbon dioxide this building will sequester. And it's, over 7,000 metric tons. So that carbon dioxide, which was absorbed by the trees because that's what they breathe, is captured in that timber and will stay there basically forever unless it's burned or let to decay. And another reason it's sustainable is that we calculated that it can be replaced with natural growth in Canadian and US forests in about 25 minutes, which is astonishing if you think about it. And then a sort of a way you translate this so that lay people can understand it is the bottom paragraph, which is it's the equivalent of taking 2,400 cars off the road for a year. And we can see, unfortunately, during this COVID-19 outbreak, how quickly the atmosphere recovers when the amount of carbon dioxide and other pollutants that are being dumped into it. I think we've probably all seen pictures of like cities and how clear the air is right now, and that's happening around the world. So, technically speaking, this is sort of a structural diagram of what we're doing here. So you can see the podium, you can see the timber components, and then if you look carefully, you can see through the top, the cores are poking through. So it is a hybrid structure. We are doing about half of the timber is concealed, and there's reasons for that. One is a cost issue. And one is basically, again, like carbon 12, concealing the plumbing. So the cost issue is basically the fact that the timber that's exposed has to be really, truly oversized, because basically the timber fireproofs itself. So any of our timber columns or beams that are exposed are oversized by 4.5 inches in every direction. It's called the sacrificial layer. And that's been tested to prove that it can burn for 3 hours and still be structurally stable. And that's the requirement, because our building, that's the requirement of buildings that are over 180 feet tall, which we are. So this is just a quick kind of overview of the systems, and it's also a pretty good indicator of how the building will be built. So we have a deep foundation system, we pour our concrete podium, and then we erect the timber on top of that. It's likely that those cores will be all the way up before the first timber arrives. And so there is no prescripted code under which this is allowable, but the code that Wisconsin lives under has a performance-based path to approval. Again, following what happened with framework in Portland, if there's an alternative means language in the code that basically says if you prove that you can meet the criteria for a building of this height through independent third-party testing, then you can find a path to approval. So Newland directed us to pursue this as a mass timber building a little over 2 years ago. And our first presentation 60 days later of an early concept was to the DNS, stands for the Department of Neighborhood Services, to their commissioner, who has since been elevated to the secretary of the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources, because basically if DNS did not sort of even conceptually approve of this as a concept, it was dead. We were very fortunate in that the commissioner of DNS at the time has a forestry background. He was acquainted with the technology and was an enthusiastic supporter. So he had us introduce it to his staff, and just conceptually in the summer of 2018. The project was unveiled. We traveled to Dubai in the fall of 2018. Because CTBUH stands for the Council on Tall Buildings and Urban Habitat. They had been aggressively starting a tall timber track in their studies and in their conferences. And then we also presented to MFD, which is the Milwaukee Fire Department. Milwaukee Fire Department does not typically involve themselves in building permits because the city has a full-time fire engineer. In this case, extraordinary circumstance, they did involve themselves. We were happy to accommodate them, and they have been fantastic to work with. One of their battalion chiefs had been studying mass timber and is kind of an expert in the topic, so that's been fantastic. And then late last year, again going back to the performance-based testing, our vertical structure has to withstand a 3-hour fire test. It had never been done before, but the Forest Products Lab, which is a subset of the U.S. Department of Agriculture, they offered to perform the testing in their lab in Madison for free, which everyone liked. And so they burned 9 columns, which we'll see in a second, and they all passed the test, which is great. And so right now, as of February, we have applied for a building permit, and we are working through the various variances with the Department of Neighborhood Services. We have a call with them later today. And the last date is a little incorrect at this point. We're currently looking at breaking ground in July. The COVID-19 outbreak has sort of thrown everything a little bit sideways, so we're working through that. When we met with the fire department, this was fresh in their minds. So this is the Trinity Church on 12th and Highland that burned in 2018. Catastrophic fire. If you look at the image on the lower left, you can sort of see that the only structural elements that didn't fail were the mass timber trusses. And these are, on the right, are images that the fire department took to understand how the timber performed in a fire. And so you can see it charred exactly as predicted. The image on the lower right shows the temperature that they estimate on the surface of the timber versus what was happening in the core of the beam. And our testing that FPL did followed this pattern. Just some early iterations. The image on the left was the very first thing we showed, the alderman downtown and the commissioner of DNS. And then the image on the right is where we are today. So we've grown, just as the design evolved, from 19 to 25 stories, and we can talk about that. So you can actually see on the image on the left, we didn't yet have the amenity deck on the top of the building, but you can generally see that the thing has sort of, it settled in pretty quickly. We can see the parking podium, and then we can see the timber glassy structure above. And the amount of glass is really great because my client wants to show off the building material, and rightly so. This diagram, it's actually more important to see the diagram on the left, and that is a ceiling plan. So anything that's in gray is a drop drywall soffit. Again, it's concealing plumbing, mechanical, electrical, And then anything that's in tan is exposed timber. So what you can kind of see is that all of the living rooms and all of the bedrooms, basically anything on the outside wall is exposed timber. If you think back to that carbon-12 image that I showed, that's about what we're going for, and so far so good. Very quickly, there's two kinds of connections, and again, this is driven by cost. This is a simple bearing connection, so wherever a column to beam connection exists that's concealed by drywall and doesn't require that extra 9 inches of char, we can reduce the size of the columns and fireproof it with drywall. And this connection is much simpler than an exposed connection, which is this connection. This was tested for the framework project. Again, we owe that project a huge debt because this was the project where the connector has to pass a 2-hour fire test. And framework did all that testing in conjunction with the University of Oregon and the state of Oregon and passed those tests. So we're relying on their test data, which was made public, to prove to the city that our connectors can pass a 2-hour test. But this connection is, you can also see the columns much bigger. This connection is far more expensive than the simple bearing connection. Even if you're not in the industry, you can see there's a lot more stuff happening here. So this is, and again, this is one of the slides that I took out, but I just jumped back in. This is just kind of an example of how a timber structural system interacts with a building enclosure. And so you can see, if anyone who's in the industry, it's not that different. There are some, especially in the image on the right, there are some waterproofing and fireproofing details that are a little bit above and beyond, but really the timber slab acts much like a PT slab, or I'm sorry, post-tension concrete slab. And it's a flat plate. It's about 7.5 inches thick with a lightweight concrete topping on it. And again, just some of the waterproofing and fire stopping details are a little bit different. Again, this is a rendering out of date, by the way, for what one of our units would look like. It's out of date because at the very beginning, we thought that our connectors would be exposed steel, which you can see if you look where the columns are hitting the beams, and they would be protected by intumescent paint. What we learned during the process is that does not work. And so the connectors are completely concealed and protected by the wood char layer. Again, this is an early image of our amenity level, so you can sort of see what the views would be like and the level of fit and finish. We're actually finalizing this right now. We have concrete, at the top of the concrete podium, we have a four-season swimming pool that is, it features operable accordion glass walls. So when the weather is nice, it can be opened up and get fresh air. I don't recommend this. It's proving to be kind of a detailing nightmare, but we're doing it anyway. And then again, a view to the east, again, just featuring the timber and living areas. A little more practically, this was taken in December of last year. This was the Forest Products Lab. This is their burn furnace. So this is what's called an unloaded test. It was strictly to determine if these things could survive a 3-hour fire with enough material left to be structurally sound. If you look carefully at the image on the right, you can see the sensors that FPL placed into the member. This is a column that's been sawn in half. They saw it in half. They put the look carefully, you can see them right here. They put the sensors in to basically figure out what the temperature is inside. They put the member back together, and then they put it into the furnace, which is the image on the left. And this is actually a photograph of the member that was tested on the day we were there in the furnace. There are little windows that you can look into the furnace. And the image on the right is 3 of the samples that they had tested previously. The reason there's 3 of them is that there are 3 different species of wood. One is Canadian Douglas fir, one is Canadian black spruce, and one is Austrian white spruce. And they all basically performed pretty much identically by the time the test was done. A little bit of another reason why mass timber is appealing to developers is it's basically tinker toys. And so this is just some examples of how these members are put together. they're hand set in the field. It goes up incredibly quickly. And you can basically see in the image on the left that they are just, they're knocking it into place with a rubber mallet. This is Brock Commons back in Vancouver. So this is what our building will look like if it's under construction. That is, the cores go all the way up. We worked with Milwaukee Fire Department to ensure that there will be firefighting capacity during construction. The stairs will be in place. There will be standpipes for water in these concrete cores because the building is vulnerable during construction. So we've worked through a plan with Milwaukee Fire Department to make sure that they can fight a fire even during construction. And this is just a view of the east side of the building looking back towards downtown. And that is our presentation. So happy to take any questions anyone has.